The storm came in sideways. That was the thing about the high passes of the Cascades in November. The snow didn't fall so much as it attacked. It came in from the northwest at angles that defeated windshields, jammed door seals, and turned the yellow centerline of Route 9 into a rumor beneath 8 inches of compacted white. Marcus Webb had driven this road 400 times in his life. He'd driven it in ice. He'd driven it in mudslides. He'd driven it once behind a semi that had jackknifed at mile marker 44, and he'd sat for 3 hours reading a paperback mystery until the highway patrol cleared the wreckage. He was not a man who rattled easily. But tonight, at 11:47 p.m. on the 14th of November, something made him pull over. He couldn't explain it afterward. Not to the reporter who called. Not to the documentary crew that came 18 months later. Not even to his sister who knew him better than anyone alive. He would only ever say, something felt wrong up ahead, not the road, something else. He pulled the truck onto the gravel shoulder, engaged the parking brake, and sat there with the wipers thrashing back and forth across a field of white static. He saw them because his headlights were still on. 2 shapes in the drainage ditch to his right, low to the ground, not moving. Marcus sat for 3 full seconds, which, for a man of his particular temperament, was a long time to sit and not act. Then he opened the door, took the full force of the wind across his face, and walked into the storm. They were small, that was the first thing. Smaller than he expected from the silhouettes, which he'd taken for adults. Up close, huddled together in the frozen mud at the bottom of the ditch, they were clearly children. Except they were not children in any way Marcus Webb had ever seen. He crouched down, his flashlight swept across them. The first one, the larger of the 2, had skin the color of raw slate, slightly luminescent at the fingertips, as though small lights were pressed beneath the surface. She had 4 fingers on each hand, long and jointed at 2 places where human fingers had only 1. Her face was structured around enormous eyes, currently closed, with a secondary ridge of tissue above the brow that was probably some kind of protective membrane. Her ears, or what he took for ears, were flush against the side of her skull, 2 curved apertures that reminded him of a nautilus cross-section. She was wearing something that might have been a garment, a one-piece material that looked semi-rigid, the kind of thing you design for low-gravity environments, now crumpled and useless against the Cascade cold. The second one was smaller, younger, he guessed, though he had absolutely no framework for guessing age in a species he'd never seen. She was curled against the larger one's side, one arm wrapped over her chest in a posture that was unmistakably protective, the universal grammar of an older sibling shielding a younger one. She was shaking. He could feel the trembling even before he touched her. Marcus Webb was 43 years old. He had spent 11 years as a wildland firefighter, then transitioned to logistics work for a lumber company, then started his own supply chain consulting practice out of his house in Wenatchee. He had no children. He had no relevant training for this situation. He had no protocol, no procedure, no chain of command. He had his truck, his emergency kit, and the fact that 2 small creatures were dying in front of him. He picked up the smaller one first. She weighed almost nothing. Her body temperature was so far below human baseline that the cold of her skin came through his jacket as a physical shock. He carried her to the truck, put her in the passenger seat, cranked the heat to maximum, then went back for the larger one. The larger one was conscious. Barely. Those enormous eyes had opened into slits, and something that might have been a word came out of her, a syllable in no human language, low and damaged at the edges. "I've got you," Marcus said, which was true and probably meaningless. "You're going to be okay," he added, which was less certain but felt necessary. He carried her to the truck. He called 911, got a dispatcher named Carl who handled the 2 injured individuals, possibly non-human, part with professional calm that Marcus would later appreciate enormously. He called his friend Dr. Patricia Reyes, who was technically a veterinarian but had an emergency medicine background, and who, when he said, "I found 2 alien children in a ditch," only asked, "Are they breathing?" "Yes." "Any wounds?" "Not visible ones." "Bleeding?" "Not that I can see." "Then focus on heat and airway, and I'll be there in 20 minutes. He focused on heat and airway. 18 minutes later, Patricia pulled in behind him, medical bag over her shoulder, moving at the kind of pace that had nothing to do with the storm or the cold. She took one look through the truck window and said, "Okay," in the flat professional way that meant her brain had already moved past the astonishment and into the problem. "Respiratory pattern on the small one is labored," she said, 3 minutes into her examination. "Whatever their normal temperature is, they're below it. We need controlled warming, not fast warming." "Hypothermia protocol." "Modified, yes." "Where are we taking them?" Patricia thought for exactly 2 seconds. "Your house. Not a hospital. Not yet. If we take them somewhere official tonight, they become property of the government by morning. You found them. That makes you responsible for what happens next." Marcus hadn't thought about it that way. He found he agreed with it instantly. "Your house," he said. "Let's go." Part 2, 11 days. They warmed slowly. Marcus converted his spare bedroom into something approaching a controlled environment, space heaters running on variable settings, a humidifier, blackout curtains because the older one flinched badly at direct light. Patricia came twice a day. She kept meticulous notes in a journal she would later describe as the single most significant medical document of the 21st century, though she said it dryly, and with a slight eye roll because Patricia Reyes was not a woman who inflated her own significance. On the 3rd day, the older sister became alert enough to sit up. She did not speak, she studied the room. She studied Marcus, who was sitting in the chair by the door reading a logistics report on his laptop, pretending to work and absolutely not pretending to steal glances at her every 45 seconds. She studied her own hands, flexing those long double-jointed fingers as if confirming they still worked. Then she looked at him directly and said something. 3 syllables, clear, deliberate, not a question, an introduction. "I don't understand," Marcus said carefully, "but I want to." She said it again, then she pointed at herself. "That's your name?" he asked. She tilted her head in a way that didn't mean yes, but wasn't no. "I'm Marcus," he said and pointed at himself. The name seemed to require adjustment. Her mouth was structured differently. The jaw moved on a slightly different axis than a human jaw, the lips more flexible at the corners. She attempted it. What came out was something like Marcus, which was close enough that he smiled. She registered the smile, studied it. Then, carefully, she produced something with her mouth that wasn't quite a human smile but was clearly meant to approximate one. The effect was a little unsettling, in the way that seeing your own face in a slightly wrong mirror is unsettling, but Marcus didn't let that show. He said, "I'll call you Vera, until I can say yours right, is that okay?" She did not understand. But she would learn that word okay before she learned any other, and later, much later, she would say that it had been the first human concept that made sense to her. Not a question, not a command, a checking in, an asking without demanding. "Okay, are you okay? Is this okay? We can stop if it's not okay." The concept of being asked. The younger one woke fully on day 5. She was faster to trust, the way younger siblings often are, or perhaps it was that she woke knowing her older sister was already awake and present, which meant the threat level had been pre-assessed and found acceptable. She watched Marcus with the complete unguarded attention of the very young, cataloged every expression on his face, and decided something on the 6th day that she communicated by climbing out of bed and following him down the stairs. He named her Lena. Patricia, watching all this from her scientist's remove, said on day 8, "You understand that what you've done here is statistically improbable to the point of being essentially miraculous. The temperature at which you found them, the rate of cellular deterioration we'd expect in that species at that exposure duration, they should not have survived the night." "They almost didn't," Marcus said. "They did though," Patricia paused, "because of timing. Because of a man who drives Route 9 at midnight in a blizzard, and for no articulable reason decides to pull over." Marcus shrugged. He was not a philosophical man by nature, but he'd been doing a fair amount of uncharacteristic thinking over the past 8 days. "I keep coming back to Leviticus," he said. Patricia raised an eyebrow. "My grandmother was a churchwoman, Old Testament cover to cover every year until she died. Used to quote Leviticus 24 at me when I was a kid. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. She meant it as a warning, I think, behave right or the scale tips against you." He stopped. "But I always thought it went the other way too. If someone does right by you, you have a debt. The scale tips, and eventually it rights itself. You think you'll be repaid for this." "I don't think about it that way." He watched Lena, who was sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, conducting a very serious examination of his television remote. "I just think the universe keeps its ledger. You give warmth, warmth comes back. Maybe not from the same direction. Maybe not soon, but it comes." Patricia looked at him for a moment. "That's either very wise or very naive." "Probably both," Marcus said. By day 9, Lena had learned 37 English words and had decided that, okay, coffee, Garrett. There was no dog yet, but she pointed at his neighbor's dog through the window. And why were the 4 most important ones? She deployed why with a frequency that Marcus found both exhausting and, he had to admit, philosophically clarifying. Why did he have 2 spoons? Why was the sky that particular shade this morning? Why did warm air rise? Why did he write things in a notebook instead of a device? He answered every question honestly, and if he didn't know the answer, he said so, which she appeared to accept as a reasonable response. She never seemed to ask whether he was answering truthfully. She simply assumed he was. He thought about that later. He thought about the specific quality of trust that assumes honesty rather than verifying it. It was not naivete he'd seen in those first days, how sharply Lena observed everything, how quickly she filed and categorized. It was a choice. She had decided he was trustworthy, and she extended that decision forward without revisiting it every hour. He tried to live up to that. Vera was different. Vera trusted him in the way that someone who has been trained to assess threats trusts a situation that has passed assessment thoroughly, but with the awareness that the assessment was made. She watched him more. She also helped more. On day 7, she noticed he was struggling with a logistics problem, a supply chain bottleneck analysis he'd been wrestling with for 3 days, and communicated, through a series of gestures and then a diagram drawn in the condensation on the window, that she understood what he was doing and had a suggestion. The suggestion, once he'd understood it, was correct. More than correct, elegant. She'd identified the inefficiency he'd been circling and reframed it in a way that made the solution obvious. He stared at her for a moment after he'd worked through it. "How did you do that?" he asked. She pointed at herself, said something in Veth, then carefully in English the word she'd learned that morning, study. "You study supply chains." She made a gesture that he interpreted from context as something adjacent to that, yes. "Fleet logistics," Patricia said later when he described it. "She's probably the daughter of someone in fleet management. The underlying math of logistics, moving resources through space efficiently, is probably a core competency in a spacefaring civilization. She solved a problem that's been bothering me for 3 days. She probably solved it in about 30 seconds and spent the other 3 days deciding whether to tell you." Marcus thought about that, about the careful reserve of someone who wasn't sure how a gift of knowledge would land, whether it would be seen as presumptuous or condescending or showing off, whether it would change the dynamic of a situation that was, at the moment, safe. He went back into the living room. Vera was sitting on the floor. She preferred the floor to the furniture, apparently reading one of his books by holding it up close in a way that suggested her vision operated at a different focal range. He sat down across from her. "I want you to know," he said carefully, "that you can tell me things, ask me things, correct me if I'm wrong. You don't have to be careful about whether it's welcome." He paused. "In my house, that's always welcome." She lowered the book, studied him. Then she said very carefully in English, "Okay." That was the first time she'd used the word herself, without prompting. On the 11th day, a ship appeared over the Cascades. Part 3. The Reckoning of the VETH. The Veth did not have a word for gratitude. This was not because they were ungrateful. It was because their language, which had evolved over 6,000 years of civilization, had developed no category for the particular concept of receiving something you had not earned. The Veth gave and received through systems of obligation, of registered duty, of formally acknowledged debt. Every act of care was logged, categorized, and returned with appropriate measure. What Marcus Webb had done for Vera and Lena, whose actual names, transliterated roughly into English sounds, were Verathan Sol and Leniveth Sol, daughters of Admiral Soraveth Sol, commander of the 4th expansion fleet of the Veth hegemony, did not fit neatly into any existing category of the Veth obligation ledger. He had found them. He had warmed them. He had fed them, sheltered them, learned 17 words of their language, taught them hundreds of words of his, and this was the part that broke the ledger entirely, had asked for nothing, had not reported them to any authority, had not used their presence to negotiate, had simply cared for 2 small creatures because they were small and cold and needed care. The Veth had a word for that, actually. They just never applied it to a non-Veth. The word was Solveth Kira. It meant, roughly, the debt that cannot be calculated because the debtor could have extracted everything and instead extracted nothing. It was considered the most binding obligation in Veth law. It superseded treaties. It superseded political alliances. It superseded the judgment of the Admiral Council, a body of 47 commanders who governed the hegemony's military operations, and who had, in 600 years of continuous operation, never once been overruled by a Solveth Kira claim. Admiral Soraveth Sol presented the claim at the council table on the 42nd day after his daughter's rescue. He was a being of considerable presence, 7 feet of gray-skinned, double-jointed, luminescent authority, who had commanded warfleets across 11 star systems. He stood at the head of the table and stated the situation with the precise economy of a military commander describing a tactical problem. His daughters had been lost in a planetary transit error. They had been aboard a small survey vessel that had experienced a navigation cascade, a failure mode so rare it appeared in the manuals only as a footnote. The vessel had emergency jumped to the nearest gravitationally stable body, which happened to be the 3rd planet of the Sol system, a Class M world occupied by a pre-contact biological species of bipedal oxygen breathers who called themselves, variously, humans, Homo sapiens people, and a startling variety of other terms depending on geographical and cultural origin. His daughters had survived a planetary winter exposure event. They had survived because a single member of that pre-contact species had exercised Solveth Kira. The Admiral Council received this information. Then Council member Athrin Var, the oldest and most decorated commander present, asked the question that everyone was thinking. What does he want? He has made no demands, Soraveth Sol said. He doesn't know he's entitled to any. Silence. He doesn't know our laws apply to him. He doesn't know our laws. He doesn't know what we are, beyond what he could observe. He called my daughters aliens in their presence, which they found amusing. He named them Vera and Lena because he couldn't pronounce their actual designations. He named them, Athranvar repeated. Nicknames, a human custom for expressing affection. Another silence, longer. And what does the Solvith Kira standard require? Asked a younger council member, Rishivith Dar, who was newer to the table and still asking questions the older members merely implied. Sarevith Sal looked at his colleague with an expression that, even across the enormous gulf of species difference, contained something entirely recognizable. Something like, I am going to give you the answer, and then you are going to understand the scale of what I am about to authorize. Equal return, the Admiral said. Solvith Kira demands that the recipient of uncalculated care receive uncalculated care in return. He gave everything to my daughters and asked for nothing. The law is clear. We owe him everything, and we cannot limit what that means until he defines its limit himself. He's a per-contact species. He has no concept of galactic law, galactic politics, or galactic war. He will be informed. And if his definition of everything is beyond our capacity to give. Sarevith Sal's secondary eye membrane swept across the room. In 6,000 years of Veth civilization, Solvith Kira has been invoked 11 times. It has never been found beyond our capacity to fulfill. A pause. We will not allow the 12th instance to be the first failure. How many ships? The Admiral sat down, opened the fleet manifest on the table's display surface. I've reviewed the situation on his planet. His species is not at war with any interstellar power, but there are several non-aligned predatory civilizations within 2 transit hops who have noted the Sol system's rising electromagnetic signature. He scrolled through assessment data. And there is the matter of his personal standing. He is, by his own species classification, an ordinary private individual. No formal authority, no rank, no protection. You want to change that? I want to fulfill the obligation. Sarevith Sal looked up. 5,000 ships. Honor guard, not invasion force. We go to his door. We tell him what he is owed. We ask him what he needs. Rishivith Dar spoke quietly. 5,000 ships arriving at a per-contact world will terrify the entire population. Yes, the Admiral agreed. We will need to manage that carefully. He paused. My daughters have given me some recommendations, Lena in particular. The young one. She's 7. She also speaks more English than any other Veth in recorded history. She says, and I'm translating precisely, Papa, you have to be gentle. Marcus doesn't like big displays. He pulled over for us and didn't even make it a big deal. Match his energy. The council stared at their Admiral. My daughter, Sarevith Sal said, with the quiet pride of a father who has been precisely and completely outmaneuvered by a 7-year-old, is not wrong. Part 4, what comes to your door? Part 3b, the approach. The 5,000 ships dropped out of transit in the outer reaches of the Sol system at 3:40 hours, local Earth time, specifically, local Wenatchee, Washington time, which Lena had insisted be the reference standard for the operation, causing the fleet navigation officer to have a brief and private moment of professional crisis before deciding that the daughter of the Admiral was, technically, within her authority to make this request, and that he would simply do it and not mention it in his log. The fleet held at distance for 6 hours. Protocol. In first contact situations involving per-contact civilizations, the Veth standard was a minimum 6-hour observation window before any approach. This gave analysts time to assess electromagnetic activity, orbital traffic, atmospheric conditions, and the general disposition of the planet's inhabitants. It also, the protocol specified without irony, gave the inhabitants time to notice you were there, if they were watching, and to have some form of initial reaction before you moved closer. The observation data that came back from the Sol system was, To say the least, interesting. They noticed us, the navigation officer reported. How many? The admiral asked. Current count is 14 separate detection events. 3 military tracking systems, 4 civilian observatories, 2 amateur astronomers, one of whom has already posted the observation to a public information network with the notation, "What is this?" and 5 others of unclear origin. Public information network, the admiral said. It appears to be a system through which any inhabitant of the planet can share information with all other inhabitants, in real time. The admiral looked at his daughters. Lena looked back. "It's called the internet," she said. "It's very chaotic and I love it." Have they responded in any organized fashion? Not yet. There is some organized military communication occurring, but it appears to be internal. Discussing among themselves, not addressing us. They're trying to verify first, Vera said, before committing to a response. That's cautious and sensible. Should we transmit? Not yet, the admiral said. We wait. Patience demonstrates intent as clearly as any signal. He looked out the viewport at the blue planet. They know we're here. What they're learning right now is that we haven't done anything yet. That's the message. The 6 hours passed. On the planet below, Marcus Webb drank his morning coffee, checked his email, read a 3-paragraph briefing from a government contact that said, in careful official language essentially, "We may have incoming visitors, please stay home today," and went out to his porch. "Begin approach," the admiral said. "Standard formation. No weapons active, no tactical displays. Honor guard configuration." "Full fleet honor guard configuration," the navigation officer confirmed, "for a pre-contact, non-political private individual." "Correct." The navigation officer processed this. He had 17 years of service. He had participated in 11 first contact events. He had never once deployed full fleet honor guard for an individual who held no rank, no title, and no formal standing of any kind. He looked at his admiral and said, very carefully, "This will be in the historical record." Yes, the admiral agreed. That's the point. The fleet moved. Marcus was on his porch drinking coffee when the shadow fell. He'd been living with the shadow for 2 weeks, actually. The low-level awareness that something had changed since Vera and Lena were collected by their father's people. The change wasn't dramatic. Nobody had come to confiscate him or debrief him or lock him in a facility. Patricia had been contacted by what she described only as certain federal people, and had provided a measured and carefully nonspecific account of events that left out several things she considered private. The press hadn't gotten hold of the story. The country had, for once in its modern history, managed to keep a secret. But Marcus had felt watched, not unpleasantly, the way you feel watched when someone is paying attention to you in a protective sense, rather than a predatory one. He'd mentioned it to Patricia, who'd said, "That's probably because you are watched, and the watchers appear to be benign." He'd accepted this, and gone back to his logistics reports. The shadow on a clear November Tuesday, exactly 1 year after the night on Route 9, was not subtle. It covered his yard, his truck, the 3 acres of his property, and most of the visible sky. And it was perfectly, almost formally still. The way a very large thing holds still when it is trying very hard not to startle you. Marcus Webb looked up. He set down his coffee mug on the porch railing. He looked at the underside of the largest ship he had ever seen, or that any human being had ever seen, hovering approximately 1,200 feet above his property, with the quiet solidity of a mountain that had decided to change its address. Behind it, arrayed in patterns that were clearly formal rather than tactical, were more ships than he could count. He tried. He got to 30 and understood that the number was large in the way that distances to stars are large, a number that exists but cannot be felt. His phone buzzed. Patricia. He answered it. "Are you seeing this?" she said. "Yes." "Are you scared?" He thought about it. No. Why not? Because if they wanted to harm me, Marcus said slowly, they wouldn't be hovering. They'd have already done something. He paused. And it feels familiar. Something about the way that big ship is just sitting there. It's being careful, trying not to scare me. There was a silence on Patricia's end that contained, he thought, the specific quality of someone who is finding confirmation for a hypothesis they'd held for a while. Call me when you know more, she said. A smaller ship detached from the underside of the great one. It came down slowly, landed in his field to the right of the house with the precision of something that had been here before and knew the terrain. The boarding ramp extended, and two figures walked out across the frozen November grass toward his porch. He knew them before they were halfway across the field. He knew the taller one's gait, the slightly forward lean, the deliberateness of each step, the way she assessed terrain before committing weight to it. And he knew the smaller one's gait, which was to say, she was not walking so much as managing herself against her own urgency to run. Lena ran. She covered the last 40 feet at a speed that made him step back against the door purely on instinct, and hit him approximately mid-torso with the full force of a 7-year-old who has spent 12 months wanting to do exactly this, and has been told by 3 separate authority figures that it would be inappropriate to do so upon arrival. Marcus caught her. He was a solid man and she weighed about as much as a large cat, and he'd had a year to think about this moment, so he caught her and lifted her and said, "Hey, Lena." "Marcus," she said, and then, in English that was slightly accented and very clearly rehearsed to perfection over the past year, "We came back." "I can see that," he said. "You brought some friends." "Papa's ships." "How many?" 5,000, she said. Vera said it was too many. Papa said it wasn't enough. A pause. I said match your energy. He set her down. Vera had crossed the field at her own pace and was standing at the bottom of the porch steps with an expression he'd learned to read over 11 days. The carefully composed face she used when she was feeling something large and wasn't sure of the protocol. "Vera," he said. "Marcus." Her English had also improved, though it carried a different quality than Lena's, more deliberate, more structured. She'd been working at it formally, he suspected. There was a word she wanted to say, and she found it. "Thank you" is insufficient, but it is where we begin. "You don't have to thank me." "Our law says otherwise." She straightened. "My father wishes to speak with you if you are willing." "Your father sent 5,000 ships to my house. I'm guessing he's willing to take no for an answer, but I'm also guessing he'd be pretty surprised." The corner of Vera's mouth did the thing he remembered, the attempted approximation of a human smile which had gotten better in the past year. Less unsettling, warmer. He would be surprised, she agreed. "And he has also been briefed, extensively, on your tendency to make understatements." Lena briefed him. Lena briefed everyone. Marcus looked at the enormous ship overhead. He looked at his coffee mug on the railing, still steaming. He looked at the two beings standing on his property in the late November light, one small and practically vibrating with contained delight, one tall and composed and carrying something enormous and complicated in those wide eyes. "All right," he said, "let me get my jacket." Part 5, The Admiral's Ledger. Admiral Sorevithsal was, in person, exactly what Marcus had expected from a man who commanded 5,000 warships. He occupied space in a specific way, the way men who are accustomed to enormous responsibility occupy space, not aggressively, but with a settled, unavoidable presence. He was 7 feet tall. He had the same luminescent fingertips as his daughters, the same wide eyes, though deeper set, with more lines at their corners. He was wearing something that was clearly formal, layered, structured, with rank insignia that Marcus couldn't read but could intuit. He met Marcus in the main compartment of the ground ship. He was standing when Marcus came in. He bowed, a specific, formal bow, not a casual one. Marcus nodded back, because he didn't know the specific weight of what he was receiving, but he recognized gravity when he saw it. "Mr. Webb," Sorivithsal said, in English that was accented but fluent, "I am the father of your Vera and Lena." "Admiral," Marcus said, "your daughters are remarkable." "Yes," a pause, "because of you." "Because of themselves." The Admiral looked at him. "My daughter Lena briefed me extensively on your approach to receiving credit." "What did she say?" "She said you make a face like you ate something bad whenever anyone calls you a hero." Lena, from the corner where she had installed herself cross-legged on some kind of equipment case, said, "I said uncomfortable, not bad food, uncomfortable." "The briefing was specific," the Admiral said. Marcus sat in the chair he was gestured toward. The Admiral sat across from him. Vera stood near her father, slightly behind, with the posture of someone who is functioning as translator in reserve and also bodyguard, and also, unmistakably, a daughter who is watching her father meet the man who saved her life. "Be direct," Sorivithsal said. "My people have a law, it's called Salvith Kira. I won't explain all of it now. Vera has a document prepared if you want the full text, but the relevant part is this. When someone provides uncalculated care, meaning care given without negotiation, without demand, without knowledge of what they were owed, the obligation created is the largest that our law recognizes. It can't be quantified. It can only be fulfilled by asking the recipient what they need." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "And the 5,000 ships are here to protect you while we have this conversation and to demonstrate that the offer is real." The Admiral's voice was steady, but Marcus heard something else in it, something that was not diplomatic. "I am a military commander, Mr. Webb. I deal in exact exchanges, resources for resources, force for force. My daughters' lives have an exact value to me. I cannot give you their exact equivalent because I don't know what that would mean to you, but I can give you proximity to equivalent." "You don't owe me anything," Marcus said. "The law disagrees. I'm not Veth, your law doesn't apply to me." The Admiral looked at him for a long moment. "My law," he said carefully, "applies to the situation, not the species. You performed an act that falls within its scope. The law does not ask whether you knew it existed. It asks only whether the act was genuine." He paused. "Was it?" Marcus thought about Route 9 at midnight, the headlights, the two shapes in the ditch, the weight of Lena against his chest, that terrible cold coming through his jacket. "Yes," he said. "Then the law applies." The Admiral leaned forward slightly. "Let me ask you differently, Mr. Webb, not as legal obligation. As a father, what do you need? What does the man who pulled over in a blizzard and saved 2 children that his entire civilization didn't know existed, what does he need? What would make his life better? What would protect him?" Marcus Webb sat in a chair aboard an alien warship while 5,000 more warships waited in the sky above his property in Wenatchee, Washington. He thought about Patricia, who had journals full of medical observations she couldn't publish because she had no framework to publish them into. He thought about Route 9 and whether someone else would stop the next time something impossible lay in a ditch. He thought about the fact that his species was broadcasting itself across the electromagnetic spectrum into a galaxy they didn't yet understand, with no idea what was listening. He thought about Lena, who was currently, without any apparent permission, operating something on the equipment case she was sitting on. "Lena, what are you doing?" he asked. "Learning your logistics," she said absently. "That's my supply chain software." "I know, it's inefficient in 3 places. I'll fix it." He looked at the Admiral. "Is she always like this?" "Since she was 4, the Admiral said. Her sister was the same at that age. They are both," he paused, choosing the English word with visible care, "thorough." Marcus turned back to the Admiral. "Here's what I need," he said. "Not for me, or not just for me," he thought for another moment. "My species is going to make contact eventually. You know we exist now. Others probably do too. When that happens, we're going to walk in blind. We're going to make mistakes, and some of those mistakes are going to be catastrophic, not because we're bad, but because we don't know the rules. Yes, the Admiral agreed quietly. I want a roadmap, not a treaty. I'm not authorized for a treaty, and honestly, I don't trust treaties because the people who make them are always a step ahead of the people they're meant to protect. He chose his words carefully. I want to know the ledger, what your laws are, what's a debt and what's an insult and what's a declaration of war and what's just a misunderstanding. I want to be able to give that to people who can use it. He paused. And I want the people who find the next person in a ditch, alien or human, to have a reason to pull over. The Admiral was very still. That's what you want, he said. Knowledge. And time, Marcus said. Time for my species to learn it before someone makes a mistake that can't be taken back. Saravathsal looked at his daughter. Vera was watching Marcus with an expression that was no longer the composed diplomatic mask. It was something Marcus had seen on her face only once in those first days, when she'd been well enough to be aware of her surroundings and had understood that she was safe. That stripped down, very young, very honest expression. The Admiral stood. He extended his hand, four-fingered, double-jointed, luminescent at the tips in the human gesture. He'd had a year to research it. We have an agreement, he said. Marcus shook his hand. Part 6, what the ledger says. After the handshake, the Admiral sat back down and was quiet for a moment. There was something in his bearing that shifted, a subtle thing. The way a man who has been holding military posture for 3 hours finally permits himself to breathe differently. I want to tell you something outside of law, he said. Not admiral to contact individual, father to father though you have no children, father to the person who held my children. Marcus nodded. When the emergency signal reached us, when we learned where they had landed, and in what conditions, I ran through the survivability calculations. 12 times. I ran them in my head on the transit to the Sol system, knowing already what the numbers said. At the temperatures your weather systems record, at the exposure duration we estimated, with no shelter, no thermal regulation. He stopped. Started again. The children of the Veth cannot regulate temperature across species-hostile climate differentials without technological assistance. Without assistance, they lose coherence very quickly. They would have been gone before your dawn. The word gone was flat, final, the word a commander uses for losses. I know, Marcus said quietly. You do not understand what you saved, the Admiral said, not unkindly, not as correction, as simple fact. Verathan Sol is enrolled in the Contact Excellence Program. She will, if she continues on her current trajectory, be one of the most significant diplomatic figures of her generation. The hegemony has had 6 centuries of expansion and contact. She is in the top percentile of aptitude assessments we have seen in 40 years. He paused. And Lena. For the first time, the precise military composure did something complicated at its edges. Lena is what she is. There is no category for Lena. We have run assessments. The assessors keep coming back and saying there are more assessments they'd like to run. She fixed my logistics software last night, Marcus said. Yes, she sent me a report. She sent you a report. She sends me reports about everything. It is her expression of affection. The Admiral's expression was that of a man who has received 17 pages of technical analysis from his 7-year-old and has chosen to interpret it as a love letter. She also sent me a report on your dog, which she rates very highly. The dog, she writes, demonstrates efficient emotional communication through physical proximity, which is a tactic that humans should use more. She includes a recommendation that I implement this finding in my interactions with my crew. Marcus felt his mouth doing something he couldn't quite control. Did you? I put my hand on the navigation officer's shoulder this morning and he looked at me like I was ill. The Admiral looked at him steadily. She is 7. She has already changed how I command my fleet. She'll change a lot of things, Marcus said. Yes, The admiral looked at his hands. Because you pulled over. He looked up. I needed to say that, outside of law, the law will be fulfilled, I have no doubt of that. But before the law I needed to say, I know what you did. I know what it cost you, which was not nothing, your time, your certainty, your privacy, your quiet life in this house on this mountain. And I know you did it without knowing what it was worth, which makes it worth more, not less. He paused. My grandmother had a saying. Veth grandmothers apparently share a profession with human ones. She said, the gift that costs the giver their peace is the only gift that the universe notices. Marcus thought about Route 9 at midnight. He thought about Patricia's car pulling in through the snow. He thought about the silence of the mountain when it was just him and two small cold creatures, and no protocol in the world to tell him what to do next. It didn't cost me my peace, he said. It gave me some. The admiral regarded him. Yes, he said, I think I understand that. They called it the Cascade Accord, eventually, though the name didn't come from anyone official. It came from a journalist who got hold of the story 8 months after Marcus's meeting with the admiral, and who named it after the mountain range where it had started, which Marcus thought was as good a name as any. The document itself, the roadmap, was 600 pages in English translation. It covered 22 recognized interstellar civilizations, their legal structures, their concepts of debt and obligation, their histories of contact with other species, what had gone well, and what had gone catastrophically wrong and why. It covered the known non-aligned civilizations in the Sol system's broader neighborhood, which was information Marcus passed to certain people quietly, without fanfare, and which caused those people to have several very serious private meetings over the following year. It also covered Veth law, including the Solveth Kira clause in full, which legal scholars would later describe as either the most or least enforceable piece of interstellar law they'd ever encountered, depending on their approach to jurisdiction. Patricia published 3 papers. She published them under a pseudonym at first, then under her own name when it became clear that the pseudonym was pointless, since everyone who mattered already knew. The papers were collectively titled Clinical Observations Across Species Boundary, Notes from 11 Days. They were cited in the first edition of the textbook that would, within a decade, be used in every xenobiology program at every university that had managed to establish one. She dedicated the papers to Marcus, who made the bad food face when she told him. Vera came back twice in the first year. She was formally enrolled in something the Veth called a contact development program, which was essentially what it sounded like, a structured process for building understanding between her species and Marcus's, using Marcus's kitchen table as the headquarters. She brought documents. She brought recordings. She brought cultural artifacts for which Marcus had no context, and which he dutifully passed to people who could contextualize them. She also, on her second visit, stayed for 3 weeks. She helped him with his logistics software, which she found fascinating in a limited way, like a simple puzzle made of interesting material. She walked Route 9 with him once in daylight, standing at the exact spot where the drainage ditch had been. She was quiet for a long time. I've thought about this place for a year, she said. So have I, Marcus said. I've tried to understand why you stopped. She turned to look at him. Lena says you felt something was wrong, but that's not an explanation. There are many things that feel wrong. People walk past them. Marcus looked at the ditch. The snow was already building in it. Another November, another storm coming. My grandmother used to say, when you see the scale, you have a choice about which way it tips. He paused. I think that's as close as I can get. Vera was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Solveth Kira. In our oldest text, the origin of the law is described as follows. A Veth warrior thousands of years ago was crossing a desert. He found an enemy soldier dying of thirst. He gave the soldier water and carried him to shelter, though it cost him his mission, his resources, and his standing with his commanders. He asked for nothing. He knew his enemy. He helped anyway. She paused. The texts say that soldiers' children built the first alliance between those two clans. And from that alliance came the foundation of the hegemony. Marcus looked at her. All of that from water in a desert. All of that, Vera agreed, from one person who decided to stop. Lena, who had come with her sister and was currently crouched at the edge of the ditch, examining the snow the way she examined everything, with the focused attention of someone who believed every surface contained data, looked up. Eye for eye, she said. She'd been reading Marcus's grandmother's Bible. He'd lent it to her on her second day in his house, when she'd pointed at it on the shelf with an inquiring look, and she had apparently kept reading it in translation ever since. Lena, Vera said. No, it's correct, Lena said. Eye for eye means the scale has to balance. He gave them warmth. So warmth had to come back. It's the same law, different words. She looked at Marcus with those enormous Veth eyes. Your grandmother and our lawgivers had the same idea. Marcus Webb stood on the shoulder of Route 9 in November, in a country that was slowly, privately, preparing to take its first formal steps into a galaxy it had just learned was populated, complicated, and in some essential way, governed by the same principle that a woman in Wenatchee had quoted at her grandson for the entirety of his childhood. He thought about ledgers. He thought about the weight of two small creatures in a blizzard, and the fact that the scale, apparently, had noted the transaction and begun working through its calculation. He thought about what 5,000 warships in the sky had felt like, not like a threat, like a balance being corrected. Come on, he said, storm's coming, let's get back to the house. Part 7. Years pass. The years pass the way years do, unevenly, with some weeks lasting longer than months and some months gone before you noticed. Marcus turned 44, 45, 46. His consulting practice absorbed new clients and shed old ones. He got a dog, a large mixed breed named Garrett, who treated the periodic presence of Veth visitors with the philosophical calm of a dog who has decided that unusual things are simply the texture of this particular life. The Cascade Accord moved through the quiet channels of its implementation, which was slow, careful, and largely invisible to the general public. There was a moment, in year 2, when it almost became very public, when a journalist got hold of the wrong end of the story and was building something inflammatory about secret agreements. Marcus asked Vera to explain the Solveth Kira framing to the relevant human authorities, and the journalist in question received a briefing that left him more interested in the extraordinary cooperation angle than the conspiracy angle. The piece that ran was, by the standards of the genre, almost gentle. Lena sent messages, many messages. She had taken to human communication technology with the enthusiasm of someone who had found a toy that was almost as interesting as everything else. The messages covered her studies. She was enrolled in what the Veth considered a dual track of military strategy and xenobiological diplomacy, a combination she described as useful and not boring, which is the best I usually hope for. Her opinions on several Earth films she'd watched in translation. She loved Westerns, which she considered efficient narratives with clear moral architecture. Her continued work on his logistics software, 3 versions of which she had upgraded remotely without being asked, each time sending a brief note saying, "I improved some things," and a detailed technical appendix that Marcus passed to software engineers he trusted, and occasionally things that were clearly not academic observations, but rather the ongoing interior monologue of a young person growing up in 2 worlds simultaneously. In one message in year 4 she wrote, "Vera says I shouldn't tell you this because it's personal, but I'm going to because I think you should know. When we were in the ditch I was not afraid. I knew Vera was there. But I was very cold and I knew the cold was wrong and I knew we might not get warmer. And then there was light. And then there was warmth. And I remember thinking very clearly even then, something answered. Something in the universe was paying attention and it answered." She paused in the message, which Marcus could tell because the timestamp jumped. I don't know if that's theology or physics. Vera says it's neither, it's statistics, but I still think it was something paying attention. I think it was you paying attention. And I think the universe noticed that someone was paying attention and decided to make it matter. Marcus read this message sitting at his kitchen table with Garrett's head in his lap in the early morning before the rest of his day began. He read it twice. Then he wrote back, "Your grandmother sounds like my grandmother." Lena replied 3 minutes later, "I think so too." Epilogue: what the ships meant. In year 5, something happened that Marcus had half expected and half dreaded. 3 other contact incidents came to light, not his, not Veth, not even the same quadrant. 3 separate instances, in 3 countries, in 3 different circumstances, of humans encountering non-human beings and making choices. One of those choices had been very good. 2 had been less good, though not catastrophic. The Cascade Accord framework, the roadmap, the understanding of what constituted debt and insult and declaration and misunderstanding, had provided enough context for the less good situations to be walked back before they escalated. Marcus read the briefing documents carefully. He felt something complicated and specific. Not pride, exactly. Something more like the feeling of watching a training protocol work under actual conditions, relief threaded through with vigilance, because a protocol that works twice isn't necessarily a protocol that will always work. He sent Vera a message. 3 more contact events. How do we make sure there are people trained for this ahead of time, not just after? Vera's reply came within 6 hours. Working on it. Lena has 17 suggestions. I've narrowed it to 4 viable ones. Draft incoming. The draft was 80 pages. It outlined the core of what would become the first human xenodiplomacy training program, embedded in a framework that looked, from the outside, like a continuation of the existing first contact protocols that several national governments had maintained for decades without anything to apply them to. The program's most unusual feature, which Vera had insisted on and which caused considerable bureaucratic friction for about 6 months before being accepted, was a module called the Solveth Kira Principle, Uncalculated Care as Strategic Foundation. It was, essentially, a course in pulling over. Patricia taught the first cohort. She stood in a room of government and military and intelligence professionals, some of whom were deeply skeptical of a veterinarian lecturing them on interstellar diplomacy, and told them about 11 days in Marcus Webb's house in Wenatchee and what she had observed in those 11 days. Not about the aliens, but about the human, about the specific quality of attention he brought, about what happened when you gave warmth without calculating its return. Afterward, one of the senior intelligence officials had come to her privately and said, "We need to know, is this replicable, or is this a one-off based on his personal character?" Patricia had thought for a moment. Then she'd said, "My honest assessment is that Marcus Webb is unusual but not unique. He has a particular orientation toward trust and action that inclines him toward this behavior. But I've seen that orientation in other people. I think it can be cultivated. I think the environment shapes it as much as the individual." She paused. "I think if we build institutions that reward the impulse to stop and help, rather than requiring people to stop and help, we'll find we have more Marcus Webbs than we expected." The official had nodded slowly. "What institution looks like that?" "Start with the training program," Patricia had said, "and go from there." 7 years after the night on Route 9, Marcus Webb was invited to address the first formal session of what was being called, provisionally, the Sol Compact, a gathering of representatives from 6 Earth governments who had been quietly briefed over the preceding years, and were now, cautiously, beginning the process of making things official. He was not an official. He had no title, no rank, no formal standing. He was introduced as the individual whose actions initiated the contact chain that led to this session, which was diplomatic language for the guy who pulled over, which was how Marcus privately thought of himself and had never stopped thinking of himself. He spoke for about 20 minutes. He talked about Route 9. He talked about the two shapes in the ditch and the decision that wasn't really a decision so much as an inability to do otherwise. He talked about Vera and Lena and Garrett and Patricia and the 600 pages and the Salvath Kira and his grandmother's Bible and Leviticus 24 and the concept of a ledger that the universe keeps whether or not you know it's keeping it. He talked about the 5,000 ships. People keep asking me, he said, what it felt like when they appeared over my house. They expect an answer about fear or awe or the specific cognitive experience of understanding that your civilization is not alone. Those are all reasonable things to feel. I felt some of them. But the thing I remember most clearly is simpler than any of that. He paused. I felt the scale balance. I felt, not literally, not with any of my 5 senses, but somewhere deeper than senses, I felt the scale tip back to level, like something had been pending for a year and had just been resolved. He looked out at the room, at the faces of the people who were about to start negotiating the terms of humanity's first formal interstellar relationship. Salvath Kira, he said, uncalculated care, the debt that can't be totaled because the person who incurred it didn't know they were incurring it and didn't try to limit what they gave. He let the words sit. I don't think that concept is alien. I think my grandmother knew it. I think a lot of grandmothers know it. I think it's the thing that holds together every community that's ever survived long enough to pass something down. He straightened. What I hope is that we carry it forward, not just as a legal category in an interstellar accord, as a habit, a practice, the habit of pulling over, of stopping when something feels wrong, of giving warmth when we find cold without calculating what it's worth first. He stepped back from the podium. The room was quiet in a particular way, not the polite quiet of an audience waiting for applause to begin, but the specific quiet of people who have been given something to carry and are already working out where to put it. In the second row, Vera sat with her hands folded in her lap and her secondary eye membranes, which she only deployed under emotion, very slightly extended. She had been present at 7 formal human assemblies in the past 2 years as part of her contact development work. She had observed human rhetoric at its best and its most pedestrian. She had a clear professional framework for evaluating the effectiveness of communication. She set all of that aside and simply sat with what Marcus had said, the way she'd sat with things in those first days in his house, letting the meaning arrive at its own pace without directing it. He had talked about pulling over. That was the whole of it. A man who pulled over in a storm and did not analyze the decision or calculate the return. A man who gave warmth because he found cold, and that was, in his understanding, what warmth was for. She had spent 2 years studying the theoretical underpinnings of first contact. She had read the 600-page Cascade framework 3 times, and she kept arriving, from every angle of analysis, at the same conclusion that Lena had stated in the drainage ditch at age 7, without analysis of any kind. Something was paying attention, and it noticed someone else paying attention, and it decided to make it matter. In the front row, Lena was taking notes on her tablet and crying, which she would have been embarrassed about if she'd noticed, which she hadn't, because she was also smiling, and also mentally reorganizing her notes from the speech into a structural analysis she intended to publish, and also composing a message to Marcus for later that she hadn't started writing yet, but that she already knew would say, "You did it right." In Wenatchee, Washington, Route 9 ran north through the Cascades under a clear November sky. The drainage ditches were empty. The scale was level. And somewhere in the deep register of things that the universe keeps track of the vast and patient accounting that does not hurry, does not forget, and does not require that you know it is watching the ledger marked, paid in full, with warmth, as owed. The end. Production notes. Word count, words story body, 9,594. Estimated narration duration, Minutes at 160 WPM. Tone, grounded, warm, literary. HFY, human kindness as cosmic law. Seed applied. Leviticus 24:20. Eye for eye reframed as universal reciprocity, the ledger that balances all uncalculated care. Key emotional beats. Rescue right arrow, warmth right arrow, father's debt right arrow, 5,000 ships right arrow, the accord right arrow, Lena's message right arrow, the speech. Thumbnail hook. Single human silhouette against 5,000 warship formation above small house/snowy mountains.